Hi everybody, it's Az here from Heel vs Babyface. Now, when the content for Mr. Pandaria was announced, there was a very specific piece which caught my eye and I was really intrigued and interested to try it out. And that piece of content was called Scenarios. Now, the reason why it particularly piqued my interest is because we were told that this content was no longer going to have to require the necessity to have a tank or a healer to aid you. In actual fact, you didn't actually need DPS either. This three-person content, you could have any combination of the three roles. You could have 2 tanks and a healer. You could have 2 tanks and a DPS, 1 DPS and 2 tanks, 2 healers and a tank, or a DPS. I could go on, and I could go on. And that really interested me. I was kind of like, ooh, okay, so how are they going to negotiate this content? What's it going to be like? Because to me, if you're segregating the roles like that, then some feature within the scenario itself has to be really niche, fun, and obviously doesn't necessarily require you to have a set standard role. Now, I could understand the reasoning for wanting to put scenarios into Mr. Pandaria, because, let's face it, when you're queuing for a dungeon as a DPS, there's nothing more frustrating than being in a queue for 30 minutes plus. If you're a tank, you go into the queue, likelihood is you get an insta-pop. If you're a healer and they go in the queue, chances are you'll get popped within 5 minutes or so. So, if you, like most people in World of Warcraft, actually rolled and ran DPS class, it was massively frustrating. Suddenly, you had this content which was going to come into the game and you could just bing, go straight into it. The only requirement was for 2 other people. So the queue was quite clearly going to pop almost immediately. So when I actually got onto the beta for Mr. Pandaria, we found out a few things about scenarios. First of all, that they would not be available until you actually hit maximum level. Now this kind of intrigued me, worried me, and excited me at the same time. Because I thought, ooh, wait a minute. Firstly, if they're holding it for top-end content, these babies have got to be good. And then I thought, but now that they've removed group quests from leveling, I had the kind of idea that scenarios would have taken over that role to some sort of degree. You would have done a quest chain somewhere in Pandaria. You would have got to a bottleneck where you potentially had to finish off a big boss or had to do a big event or something like that. And that's where the scenario came in. You would queue up, you'd get 2 more people to help you, bingo jingo, you would finish off this quest and you would probably get rewarded with a very sexy bit of experience and most likely a blue powerful item to aid you in your leveling up. But this wasn't going to be the case. So as the beta for Mr. Pandaria rolled on, and they just gave us a level at a time to do, they didn't rush us to level 90, it was 86, and then a couple of weeks later they opened up 87, then 88, etc, etc. Once we managed to get ourselves to level 90, one of the very first things that I did was queue up for a scenario. Now, like anything, when you're testing new content, regardless of what it is, normally turns out to be quite a fun experience. And I can remember very vividly my first scenario, which was Unga Ingu. Now, it wasn't perfect. There were definitely some bugs with it. But when we came in, I was sort of like, oh, I think there was myself, another DPS, and I believe there was a Paladin tank. I'd have to go back through the Unga Ingu scenario from the beta on my channel, but I think it was 2 DPS and a tank was our makeup, and I was kind of like, oh, we got no healer, how are we going to heal ourselves? This is going to be really cool to find out how we go through this. And it started off with an escort, and then the escort led to quite a dour second phase where you had to try and fill up a cauldron. But I wasn't too concerned about that because I was running around the island of Unga Ingu and I found a zip line and I found these kind of things and I went up on the zip line and it took me to a ship and there was, I think, a massive monkey hosen monkey hosen on the ship, and I was like, oh god, this could be really, really cool. But I left the scenario with the impression that there was a lot more to add to it. I was kind of like, okay, well that's the bare bones of it. They're sort of like rolling us through the stages, and then they're going to flesh out the stages, and then we're going to get the meat onto the bones. And I was very intrigued, so I was like, oh, okay, so yeah, all the stages are basic, a little bit boring, but once they put everything around it, once they dress it up, put the makeup on it, put the wig on it, put the silicone boobs in it, it's going to be really, really cool. You know, especially with the zip line and stuff. How's that really going to come into effect? Etc, etc. Nothing got added to it. And then I started to do more of them. And then we had things like protecting green whatever village in the Jade Forest. And we just kind of just killed some ads. And then we rolled on some barrels. And then we killed some ads. And it didn't take particularly long for me to realise that these scenarios were just trash. And that's how I refer to them now. Trash content or throwaway content. There was nothing there. There was no substance. There was nothing to me within this content which made it worthwhile. There's nothing within this content to me that said, this enhances my World of Warcraft experience. And then we had other informations which started to come through once Mists of Pandaria was launched, and that was the fact that the 9 dungeons that we had were not going to be added to at all in the expansion. And this kind of got me a little bit angry, because we started to see a few more scenarios come in. Again, nothing of much worth whatsoever, and we were missing the dungeons. No content. And the content at end level proved to be pretty dour in patch 5.0 and 5.1. There was just grindy dailies. There was just gear hidden behind faction vendors. There was all this kind of monotonous stuff, and the fun element of Mists, to me, I was almost crushed within the first part of Mists of Pandaria. And that seemed to be reflected in the numbers, because people just left by the absolute dozens. And before we knew it, 10 million subscribers, currently stands at 7.6, and we still have the next figures coming out within the next few weeks. We don't know how far it's going to go down again. Then we started to get patch 5.2, and it infuriated me. And the reason why patch 5.2 infuriated me is because 5.2 was the patch they got scenarios absolutely spot on. It was fantastic. There were 2 scenarios of worth that were added in patch 5.2. There was Troves of the Thunder King, which to me, because it's experienced by everybody in the game, was absolutely fantastic. You had a section of the Throne of Thunder raid that was cordoned off. It was instanced, and you yourself, on your own, without the help of 2 more people, suddenly started to run around the place, picking up treasure chests, getting lots of loot, potentially getting yourself a nice little epic, depending on the burial trove keys that may drop for the end section. Who knows what was inside? You could have little insignias that you could sell, you got coins, you got all manner of stuff. And you could either stay in the first room and farm it for as much money as possible, and probably walk away with a good 300 to 500 gold, depending on how fortunate you are during your run, or you could have decided to push the scenario right through to the end, get some achievements for doing certain elements within inside of it, experiencing more of the scenario, getting through to the end room, defeating the end boss, and also still having plenty of time to go around and loot and accumulate some wealth. It was a very, very well done scenario that can be experienced by every single solitary person in the game. Now, quite clearly, you couldn't repeat this too often. They couldn't start doing these scenarios all over the place because of the amount of wealth that you could get from it and the amount of gear that you could get from it. But as a sort of niche, it was absolutely perfect. And to me, it kind of filled the role of what a scenario really felt like. And then we have what I think is the best scenario in the game, the second, which was brought in patch 5.2, and it was Canrathad. Canrathad, which could only be experienced by warlocks and no other class, because Blizzard decided to devise a more special way of offering green fire to warlocks, something which had been requested since the Burning Crusade expansion. And our voices seemed to go onto deaf ears, but what we were unaware of was, of course, there was a master plan. And we had this fantastically crafted scenario, which went on for approximately 30 minutes, because you went through different elements of it, and ended with potentially the best fight that the World of Warcraft has ever created. Now, what was also interesting about this scenario is it made great use of a much-loved old raid, Black Temple. So, people like myself who had experienced Burning Crusade got a very nostalgic feel to it. We saw some mirror images of some old bosses that we defeated en route to getting to Canrathad. And if you hadn't experienced Burning Crusade and the Black Temple, then you managed to get a little piece, a little nugget of how this raid once was, and potentially put in your mind, wow, I bet this was just outstanding. And of course, when we finally got to Canrathad, it was at the top of the Black Temple where Illidan once was and where we defeated him. So it was such a well-crafted event, but sadly, for a lot of people, could only be experienced by warlocks. Now, I understand why Blizzard wanted to give the green fire element to warlocks in a special way, but warlock is only one class, and it came at the cost of 10 others who were understandably a little bit upset by this event laid out for the one. If Blizzard had decided to put apart all the trash that we had, the Greenstone Village, the Unga Ingu, the Crypt of the Forgotten Kings, all that dross, and instead decided to focus their attentions on creating a single worthwhile scenario for each individual class, that would have gone down like an absolute storm. Warlocks would have got their green fire. Mages, for example, could have got the cosmetic change to their water elemental, or something of that kind of nature. Just little tweaks, cosmetic tweaks, which didn't give you an advantage, but made you feel that bit special, and of course acted as a little bit of bragging rights for however long that content was going to be relevant for. But inside me, I know why that didn't happen. And when you look at things like Crypt of the Forgotten Kings, Unga Ingu, Attack on Greenstone Village, all that kind of thing, you understand there was probably such little effort required to create that content. Whereas you can see the love, the attention, and the care that was put into crafting the 5.2 Canrathad fight. And that's why the 10 other classes didn't get it. So the reason why it infuriated me is because it was quite clear from both the Green Fire Quest and also Troves of the Thunder King that Blizzard absolutely could get scenarios correct. Now I'm going to go back in time a little bit now, because another frustrating element was the fact that Blizzard had got scenarios right all along. The problem was they weren't scenarios. And I take you to Domination Point and Lion's Landing in patch 5.1. The actual dailies which surrounded these areas were dull as dishwater and were ready to drive me insane within moments. But my sanity was brought back from the brink because at random, or seemingly random, breaks within the reputation bar, you suddenly got yourself a yellow exclamation mark, which progressed the storyline at Domination Point or Lion's Landing, depending on whether or not you were Horde or Alliance. And this storyline often took you into the big wide world, which everybody was active in, but then went and phased you. Instead of instancing you, phased you in a certain section of it, and you got to experience a great piece of story. And this is the main thing, because to me, scenarios are at their strongest when they are explaining a story. But the thing is, story to me is personal. And I don't necessarily want to experience storyline with two other people who want to go at their own pace. Is there a cutscene? Is there just some communication between two people which I want to experience? But Joe, who's next to me, doesn't want to. And so he runs off and starts to kill some more mobs. So the way that they did the Domination Point and Land's Landing was individual. They weren't scenarios, they were just classed as regular quests, but because they phased you and you were the only person that could experience that and no one else, they basically took the role of a scenario. We had other scenarios which came and went. Dagger in the Dark, which could be experienced by all, was potentially the best one when it came to trying to convey story, but still to me fell a little bit flat because I had to have two other people with which I had to either hold their hand or go at their pace, or those kind of matters which just disrupted my own personal enjoyment from that. And then later on in patch 5.3 we got the addition of heroic scenarios, which were still current scenarios or a couple of brand new scenarios which have been brought into the game, which suddenly were a lot tougher to deal with. And they weren't. But Blizzard hailed them as a success. And like most things in the World of Warcraft, success is a very, very dubious word, because just like statistics, success can be based upon a lie. And heroic scenarios weren't a success because they were heroic scenarios. Heroic scenarios were a success because Blizzard attached to it humongous amounts of valor points. Something which was so difficult to get in Mists of Pandaria. Suddenly you could go do a heroic scenario and walk off with 150 valor points for doing one. And then if you were to do repeat ones, I think you walked off with around 180 to 120, something like that. It was still a substantial amount. So lots of people were doing heroic scenarios because they were valor farming, and Blizzard decided to say these are an unmitigated success. Now, we don't know whether that's just bravado, for the sake of trying to keep spirits up within an expansion that has hemorrhaged a quarter of its customer base. And when Warlords of Draenor comes out, are they actually going to genuinely change the way that scenarios operate? Or are you going to still see this trash, three-person, don't need a brain kind of content which feels as if there is no enjoyment and no risk? And if there's no risk when you're playing with other players, then to me that content automatically becomes very dour, because without risk the reward feels lame. I like to have the risk and I like to have the reward. That's why I like to have my tanks and I like to have my healers. I like to have the cooperation of the roles. Or if you're not going to do that, then separate me from everybody and make me responsible for me, whether I'm a tank, whether I'm a healer, or whether I'm a DPS, because make that instance available for me. Set the role for me to do. If you take me into an area and phase me and I'm a DPSer, then make sure that I've got a strong NPC with which I can hide behind, or a strong NPC with which I can support. If I'm a tank, then make me have some strong NPCs in as much as they can do damage, and let me be the spearhead of this scenario. And if I'm a healer, then let me help. Let me heal the strong NPCs that are both tanks and DPSs. Personalise it. Make it relevant to my role. But don't squish me with other people. Allow me to go at my own pace. Allow me to experience the full elements of the storyline. Now, Blizzard have said that they got a good reaction from the way that things operated in patch 5.1 with the domination point and Lion's Landing storylines. Now, whether or not they just used that as a device for story while leveling up with a faction, remains to be seen. Or whether or not they do have the foresight to make this the scenario element, to me, would make a lot more sense. And then they could just very quietly filter out this 3-person, don't need to think content. So there we go. Scenarios. To me, it was a missed opportunity. It was something which on paper sounded pretty interesting, but in practice just didn't actually work. Because when you don't have the combinations of the roles, you can't genuinely have the difficulty of the content to challenge you. And that made them all very, very insipid. And I'd like to hear your points in the comment section below. And I hope you enjoyed the vid. Please do like, comment and subscribe to my channel. Follow me on Twitter, Facebook and also twitch.tv/heel versus babyface for live streaming. And I shall be back with some more stuff very soon. You take care, everybody. Bye-bye.